As we are using short, sharp, explosive movements for the most part, rather than longer held, stronger, more muscular movements, we need to maximize the amount of force that we can get into those short, sharp movements. And this is why when we read the advice of the old Wushu masters and they say, don't use muscular strength, or don't think about it in terms of muscular strength, think about it in terms of force, they don't mean don't have a physical body, they don't mean don't be strong. But they also don't mean that there's some kind of magical force that's going to take over and be there in lieu of muscular force. I know there are lots of people who say that they do mean that, but those people are just con men and con women who prey on people's insecurities to swindle them out of their gas money. What they really mean is that in short, sharp movements, i.e. Fa Li, there's a limit to how much you can engage muscular strength before it's no longer a short, sharp movement. So even the strongest person in the world has to start thinking about using their body in a different way when they want to use Fa Li. And in each one, what we're looking for is the ability to just naturally and intuitively maximize that moment of explosive force using lots of different kinds of techniques and ideas. And most of these we've encountered, like using a lock point so that we can suddenly transmit explosive kinetic force by making the whole body structure a little bit more solid, what we call the consistency of the structure at the moment of the hit point. And one of the ways we do that when we're pulling back is to create a little bit of a compression set on the rear leg so that the consistency of the rear leg solidifies using the aid of gravity. But we can also amplify the effect that we get from that. And we do that with a little hit of the heel down into the floor from the rear foot. So it's what we call a stone cracking set, like you're just trying to crack a stone under your heel. And we time that so that it hits with the compression set, and then that also allows us to bounce straight forward into the next technique. And it also works like one of those sandworm summoning contraptions in June, but for summoning dogs. And there are a range of knacky things we can do from there, like springing back up into a pivot route or keeping it flat, but they all work in the same way to suddenly change the energy back in the other direction just at the moment that you hard set the posture. But you won't necessarily see it when you do it slow, you can only just about see it. Some things only really exist as potentials until you do them with explosive fast movement, then you can see them. Okay, so it's the next part of the movement that we do after the pullback that gives the posture its name, Monarch casts wine, because this is the posture where it's like you're throwing wine in someone's face. And this is where things get a little bit more technically interesting because, as we've said, when you move backwards you're using open, but with the rear hip moving away from the lead hip. And when you change the posture, you hit with the stone cracking set and then spring forwards, you've got a choice then of whether you can use open or close. And that will change which hand is dominant, or if you want to think about it like this, which hand is throwing the wine, the lead hand or the rear hand. And that will make a significant difference as to how the posture is stacked. And here we've got to remember Wang Xiangjai talking about trained reflex. Neither of these things are intuitive, i.e. making it lead hand dominant or making it rear hand dominant. And I think a lot of people get caught out by this because there's a difference between something that's intuitive and something that's just easier. And in this case, the rear hand posture is easier, i.e. rear hand dominant. You pull back and then you change into the cross. It's significantly physically easier to perform, so most people would probably naturally go with this version, not because it's intuitive, not because it's stronger, just because it's easier. But a lot of people, I think, would confuse that with it being an intuitive movement, and that happens all the time in each one. And it's why people end up with very one-sided each one, where they don't understand or don't train properly their A settings and their B settings. So look now at how we would solve this problem. We use the pull back and then into the set and then change into the rear hand, and then we think about, well, how would we then apply it with the lead hand? So we use the open to pull back, change forward into a cross. Well, how now would we use the lead? So we try adding the lead onto the end of it, and immediately we should start intuitively feeling that we've got to do something different here. Otherwise we start bamboozling ourselves that we're trying to use a lead hand posture with close, and that isn't oppositional force, it's a kind of contraction, but it just takes all the power out of the lead hand hit. It's not against the rules, it just negates all of the power. And the reason we might want to start doing it like that is because we're thinking, well, we mirrored the context when we pulled back and we used open, so moving forwards I should just use close, right? But we forgot that when we move forward it goes back to orthodox, it doesn't mirror, so we go back to our orthodox use of contexts. And for a lead hand posture strike we just use open. In other words, we use open and then open. Open to pull back, but it's mirrored context open, rear hip moving backwards, and then immediately change forwards into open, moving forwards, orthodox open, lead hip moving away from rear hip. You would never just do that naturally or intuitively because it's a much higher level technique. I mean, you might, but I'll believe it when I see it. In any case, there's a few things that we need to work on and develop so that we can get the right bounce back from the stone cracking set at the back to push forward. So we know that the hips open, that we use open to the back. And the first thing to think about is not leaning back, just let the hips splay. As long as it's a single weighted splay, not frog's legging where it's equally weighted. So just let the hips splay and then just think about not leaning the body back. So we see all this all the time where people lean back, even some quite high level people, and I think, okay, to be fair, sometimes you want to practice that. You want to practice extending and exaggerating the movement to get that feeling. But if you drill it in that when you move back, you always lean back, then you'll just do that when it's crunch point. And you won't be able to do the compression set, but more importantly, if someone just pushes you, you'll go flying backwards. And the reason people do it, of course, is to maximise strength, get more body weight in the pullback. But the best way to do it is to use this kind of Chen Tai Chi movement where you drop and sink from the qua. And from there, try and get this more explosive movement of sinking back down, of opening the rear leg away from the lead leg. So it's kind of an explosive drop down rather than an explosive lean back. You're still using your body weight, you're just using it more efficiently. You're dropping down with it rather than moving back into an unbalanced position. And I know that a lot of the old timers do that sheerly where they lean back, but that's really something that's, well, it's had its day and we've moved on to a more modern way. Well, it's not even a more modern way of doing it, it's the Chen Tai Chi way of doing it has solved this problem in a superior way. And from there we need to do something that's more advanced than what we've done before. We need to hit the lock points, then immediately explode back in the opposite direction. So it's hit and flow, but it's much more advanced because you've got to go one direction, then immediately stop, change, and in a split second hit forward in the other direction. And you can see here physically why it seems or feels easier to go into a rear hand strike from this posture. It's highly structurally sympathetic to go from opening into closing, and particularly so if it's a mirrored version of open. So it's just the hip, the rear hip going backwards and then the rear hip going forwards, backwards, forwards. It's easy, it feels natural, it feels more powerful, it feels a lot easier to do it that way. And that's what tricks you into thinking this is intuitive. It's just easier. And for anyone who's done particularly Chen Tai Chi and you're used to this figure of eight movement with the qua, it's a very natural movement. See how it just pulls back and then flows, figure of eight, just like if you were doing cloud hands or something like that. So the rear hand just flows naturally with that figure of eight movement. It's only when you try and do it with open as the finishing posture that you've got to go against that figure of eight movement, and that's why it feels unnatural, i.e. unintuitive. But it's not unintuitive, that's just a matter of it feeling more difficult, so your body just doesn't know how to do it. In any case, we can add in the pivot route just like we would normally with a cross, so pull back, and this also adds another dimension to it because you've got to get that stone cracking set where you hit the heel down hard into the floor and then you change back up into the cross. You've got to bounce straight back up into it, so that requires excellent timing. And we'll look at this again, but Wang Xianjai emphasises that you've got to get out of this solipsistic thinking that only your structure matters, and you've got to start thinking of a structure in terms of two people. So what we're trying to do here in the first movement is infect the opponent's structure with imbalance, and then in that moment hit them. So that moment where they're not braced, that moment where their structure is loose, that's when we hit them, and that has a force magnification effect. So we've got to get it fast and we've got to get it powerful. But now look what happens if we try and use that figure of eight movement to flow into a lead hand posture. It completely distorts everything. Yes, maybe you could do it if you were avoiding a punch. That's an exceptional case. But in terms of our template posture to get the most power, we need mirrored open into orthodox open. So see, the rear hip goes back, and then we stay in that open, but we shift forwards. It's not a massive shift forwards, but it's indicated by the lead leg again, assuming it's normal posture of open, moving away from the rear leg. So it feels a little bit like it's stretching the quad. It's all about where you stop that figure of 8 movement for the lead hand punch or for the rear hand punch. So again, from the side, you can see what happens when you try and use close with the lead hand punch. And you can see you've got to change it somehow. And the solution to this is open, mirrored back, and then stop that figure of 8 movement and then just push it forwards, expand the posture again, open into open. And I have to emphasize again, all this anti-intellectualism, all these people who say don't think about it, just follow the body's intuition, you're very unlikely to intuitively work this out. You're much more likely to assume that the easiest way of doing it is the intuitive way. Again, this is why Wang Shengjai emphasizes it's problem solving, conscious, deliberate, intellectual problem solving, and then drilling it until it becomes second nature. The posture itself even looks odd, but by practicing things like this, you train your brain, you train the programming to be more adaptive, you train it to be more flexible and have more sophistication in how it can use your overall structure. And then you start training it slowly so it can be drilled into the brain. And then remember that this is in the brain, this is in the intent, not in the physical structure. It's in the programming. But then to combine it with that stone cracking set and then straight back into the lead hand punch, that is not easy. And then the final bit of the posture is to bring in the lead pivot root. And this also requires a lot of thought, because naturally you would feel like you want to turn the leg over quite a lot because you're already leaning back quite a lot. And to get more power in the posture, because it's so short, you want to turn your leg right over, get more screwing force into it. Remember, your intent is like a dog. It will just do one thing. It will try and maximize power. So if you just kind of rely on intuition, it will do the easiest thing that it possibly can to generate the most power it can, the haymaker principle. And the only way around this is you've got to bring it into conscious thought. Think about the problem logically and scientifically, just like Wang Shengjai says. I saw someone the other day had written a thing, some Yiquan instructor saying Yiquan isn't about scientific thinking, it's just about intuition. Well, that's not what Wang Shengjai says, and this is exactly the problem. You will just assume that it's intuitive to turn the leg over as far as it can to get as much power into the posture, which makes your posture much weaker. It makes you incredibly vulnerable if that leg just gets hit. Your posture is so weak. This is why we have a rule in each one that the pivot root points towards, or in most cases, points towards the hit point as a general rule of thumb. So we don't want it to turn over to get the most possible screwing force and maximise power. We want to maintain the stability, strength of the stance. I mean, sure, if you know you've just got one shot and you've got to put everything into it, then all rules are to the wind. I know that. But as a general rule of thumb, that's why the foot always just points towards the hit point. Just like the dog finds exactly the right place to balance the stick. So you've got to find the doctrine of the mean between all possible considerations. But unlike the dog, you can't just do that intuitively without setting the ground rules first. But eventually it does become intuitive and you feel that your structure is weak if you don't follow this rule. It's not just arbitrary, it's structural.